Hello, this is Michał Sorbet and this is a new episode of Wojennik TV. Today a review of a Polish game about a Polish battle, but about a battle which was also important for Europe and for the whole world. This battle was set at the outskirts of Warsaw in 1920 and it is the Battle of Warsaw. This is also the title of the game published recently in 2020 by the Polish company wydawnictwo Zielona, Sowa. Under the Polish title Bitwa Warszawska, which translated to English is the Battle of Warsaw. The game, as I explained a few moments ago, will enable us to recreate the titanic struggle between the Polish army and the Soviet forces trying to invade Poland and to bring the flame of revolution to Central and maybe even Western Europe. The Polish troops, led by Piłsudski, but also by Rozwadowski and other great Polish leaders, managed to overcome the Soviet attack, to launch a counteroffensive and to literally destroy the Soviet army at the outskirts of Warsaw. This battle was very important not only for the Polish state, which was recreated after 123 years of limbo, but it was also a very important battle for Central Europe because it forbade Soviet troops entering Central Europe and maybe even trying to bring the flame of the revolution elsewhere, maybe to Central or even Western Europe. This is a game designed by Michał Sieńko, a very experienced Polish designer who is specialized in designing games covering Polish history. So he designed, for instance, a game covering the events in Lublin in 1980 when Polish protesters tried to manifest their political but also social manifests during the communism regime in Poland. He also created a very well-received game about one of the Polish kings, Sigismundus Augustus. So, a very well-known designer, a designer who likes history, who is a bachelor in history and who knows how to create historical games. This game is designed basically for 2 players, but it is also possible to play it in a group of 3 or even 4 players. The time of play is somewhere around 45 to 90 minutes and the minimum age of the player will be 10 or higher. Today I would like to show you the elements of this game, then I would like to explain how the game works, and at the end I would like to give you my final opinion about this game and to underline both its strong but also the weaker points. So let's pass now to the explanation of the components of Bitwa Warszawska, the Battle of Warsaw. Here is the Battle of Warsaw. At first I would like to show you the elements which we will be using when playing, and then I would like to explain briefly how the game works. The first and most obvious element that we receive in this game is the game board. This game board depicts Poland during the war against the Soviets, and it is where the battle was fought in the outskirts of Warsaw. At the outskirts of Warsaw. One of the players will be controlling the Polish forces, which will be represented by the green units, and the second player will be taking control of the red Soviet troops. This game is also possible to be played by 3 or 4 players. In such a scenario, one of the players will be playing against a team of 2, or 2 teams of 2 will be opposed one against the other. Each player will receive a set of soldiers, 21 in total, and at the game start they will place all of them in the reserve, apart from 3 troops which will be placed on the second front line. The board is divided into 2 distinctive parts, the Soviet part and the Polish part. Those parts are symmetric in this sense that each player will have the same number and type of spaces on which he'll be able to place his assets. First of all, we get a distinction between three fronts: the northern front, the central front, and the southern front. Each front is additionally divided into the first front line and the second front line. This is important in terms of counting strength points for battle purpose, and it is also important for stacking purposes, because at the second front line there is a restriction imposed. Only 3 troops can be present at any given time on such a front line, unless you have a commander who increases this number up to 4, 5 or even 6 troops. There is no such restriction governing the first front line, where you can have, in theory, an unlimited number of troops. So you'll be placing troops both on the second line and on the first line. You'll be able to transfer those troops using the arrows indicating the direction of movement. You have also spaces for your commanders. You have 3 spaces, 1 for each front, so you can place a leader associated to the northern front, to the central front, and to the southern front. And you have also some additional spaces which will be used in order to place other cards. You will be using additional markers to track victory points. Those will be counted towards 7, because the main objective of the game is to accumulate 7 victory points. The first player who achieves this objective wins. In case nobody achieves this victory at the end of the 13th turn, the totals are compared, and the player who has a bigger number of victory points wins. In case of a tie, it's the player who has more troops on his second front line who wins. If it is still tied, the battle is inconclusive and no one wins. The track at the bottom will be used to track time. As you can see, we can play not more than 13 turns. You will be using additional markers, for instance, to track additional strength points granted by leaders or orders. We'll be using activation markers, which will be placed on the capacity of each leader after activating such a capacity. We'll be also using special blockade markers. Each side will have their own blockade marker, which they can place at the opponent's playing area in order to block some spaces. For instance, we can block the second front line of our adversary, which will impose a restriction in moving units on the second front line. As long as such a marker is placed here, you cannot transfer units between fronts on your second front line. You can also block a leader, which will block the possibility to use his capacity. You can block an empty space, forbidding a player to place a new leader on such a space. Or you can, for instance, block another space, also forbidding your opponent to place another card in such a space. We get also 3 special cards, which will be the additional cards for which each player will try to bid during his or her turn. And those cards will grant additional benefits in terms of additional cards drawn, additional troops added from your reserve to the front line, or also activating a special blockade marker, which can be put for the duration of 1 turn on a space of your choice, also blocking such a space. Such a marker is stronger than the 2 other ones because it cannot be moved using special actions. Now, how a turn of the Battle of Warsaw looks like. At the beginning of the game, each player places 1 troop on each of the fronts. He also grabs his deck of cards. He draws 4 cards. Initiative at during the first turn is determined randomly, but then after the first turn, the second turn and the following turns will be played in an order determined by one of the special cards. The player who achieved domination over such a card will be first player. The first turn is a little bit different than the next ones, because during such a turn you won't be resolving those special cards. Those special cards will be resolved from the second turn up to the game's end, up until the game's end. But during a classical turn, at first what you will be doing is placing the additional marker, the additional battle marker on the board. I haven't spoken about those ones. You get also 3 cubes, 3 blue cubes, which are placed on each front. Now those cubes are here in order to indicate who wins each battle, because you can score points in the Battle of Warsaw by winning battles. This will be your only way to score points. Winning the majority of battles on each front enables you to score 1 victory point at the turn's end. If you win a battle where this special yellow marker is placed, you will score 1 additional point, even if you lose more battles, if you win less battles than your opponent won during this turn. So this will be the crucial front during each turn on which such marker will be placed. Now this marker is placed randomly. You'll be rolling a die at the start of each turn to determine where this marker is placed. You will determine if this marker should be placed on the northern front, on the central, or on the southern front. At the same time, this marker cannot be placed on a front twice on following turns. So if you happen to roll a result which indicates that the marker should stay put on the same front that it was during the previous turn, it will be removed from the board for the entire turn, and it will be once more placed during the following turn. So there might be turns where this token won't be present on the battlefield, but if it is, it will indicate the crucial front, the one which will grant the most number of points at the turn's end. After determining this, we resolve all the resource cards. At first we verify who has the biggest number of cards attributed to the funds card, which determines who will draw more cards. Those cards are double-sided. You can use them during 2-player games, but also during 3 or 4-player games. As you can see, they are different. And the side who controls such a card can turn this card in the direction it chooses in order to obtain bigger benefits than its opponents. As you can see, for instance, here we can grab 3 cards each, and also the initiative marker. Our opponent will get 4 and 3 cards. If nobody wins such a card, each side will draw the same number of cards. The second special card is the card which enables you to get additional troops or move troops on the board. If you get additional troops, you grab them from your reserve and you place them on the front line of your choice. You can also move units, for instance, from the second to the first front line. Finally, you can use the special blockade marker in order to block one of the opponent's spaces. Then it's up to the players to play their actions. Each player will have a certain amount of cards in his hand, and those cards are of 3 different kinds. The first type are troops, and troops will always indicate how many and where you can deploy those troops. So you'll get, for instance, the possibility to deploy 1 troop on the first line on a front of your choice. Or you can, for instance, place 1 troop on the second front line of your choice. Some cards will require you to place those cards on a predetermined front. For instance, here you'll have to place 2 troops on the first front line of the northern front. The second type of cards are orders, which will be placed on spaces next to the board. Those cards will indicate what capacity they have, and they can also sometimes influence battles because they can, for instance, initiate battles. They can also increase the number of strength points that your army has during a battle if some prerequisites are met. So they are very useful cards, but only activated for the duration of one turn. Finally, you have also leader cards who will be placed on the board. You have 3 spaces which are empty at the game start, but then you can put new leaders. Why you want to do it? For 2 reasons. The first one is that each leader will increase the number of troops that you can store on your second front line. So your basic limit of 3 can be increased up to 4, 5 or even 6 with some leaders. The second reason is that your leaders will have also 1 or very often 2 special capacities. You'll have the freedom of choosing which of those capacities you'll be using. Sometimes it will also depend on the space where such a leader is placed. When placing such a leader, you can immediately activate one of those capacities, indicating at the same time that you use such a capacity using the special marker. If you want to play a new leader to replace an older one, you just replace this card, discarding the previous one. So this is absolutely possible. What you cannot do is move your leaders from one front to another. This is forbidden by the rules. During your actions, you can deploy troops using troop cards, you can place orders, you can place new leaders. If you want to activate a leader once more, because each leader is activated only for the duration of one turn, you can discard a card from your hand in order to activate once more a leader during a future turn. Say that this leader was placed during the previous turn. If you want to reuse its ability, one of the 2, you can discard a card in order to do so. You can also discard a card in order to change the location of one of the blockade markers. So you can change the place where your opponent placed his blockade counter, or you can displace your own blockade marker in order to hinder your opponent's movements. You can also discard a card in order to fight for resources. You discard a card placing it next to the resource cards for which you want to bid. Your opponent can do the same, but if he doesn't, at the start of the next turn, you'll be the player having the most cards next to the resource card, and you'll be able to switch the side of such a card in order to receive a bigger advantage. Now, those are all the actions that you can do during your turn. After each player plays all their cards from their hand or passes, because it is possible to pass and to keep some cards in our hand, it is time to resolve the battles. The battles are resolved from the northern front, passing through the central front up to the southern front, and battles are resolved using a comparison of strength points. Each troop present on the first front line gives you 2 strength points. Each troop present on the second front line gives you 1 point. You can receive additional points thanks to leaders and to orders placed on such a front. You compare the values of both armies. The army who has a bigger strength wins such a battle, and the token is moved to its side. We resolve with each battle and we verify who won the bigger number of battles. For instance, 2-1 or 1-0, because it is possible also to have unresolved battles ending with draws. The player who achieved most victories receives 1 victory point. In the rare case that a player wins all 3 battles on each of the 3 fronts, he receives 1 additional point. Additionally, the player who managed to win the battle where the special marker is placed also receives 1 point. So it is possible to win up to 3 points during one turn. After the resolution of each battle, all troops present on the first front line from both sides are removed back to their reserve. The troops staying on the second front line stay where they are not removed. The turn ends by discarding the activation markers from leaders, by removing all the cards which are only present for one turn, by moving the turn marker one space forward, and by starting a new turn. We play up until the moment one of the players achieves victory, reaching the 7th spot on the victory point track, or reaching turn 13, or if our deck runs out of cards. And those are all the rules governing the place of Bitwa Warszawska, the Battle of Warsaw. Now I would like to invite you to my final thoughts. I'd like to tell you what I think about this game, what I think are its strong but also a little bit weaker points. At the beginning of this review, I have already said that the Battle of Warsaw is a very important subject both in the history of Poland and in the history of Europe in general. But if we look for games covering this topic, we can see that this was very rarely used both in wargaming and also in board gaming in general. So when looking for positive aspects of this game, I'd say that one of the major ones will be the fact that this is a game which covers such an important topic, and at the same time a very underrated or underused topic in the aspect of game designing. It is important to create games about your own history, and the history of Poland is rich, it is full of interesting events. I'm glad that this very important battle was finally used as a theme to a game. And I hope that there will be other games covering other important elements and important moments in Polish history, because we have a 1000 rich history and we are proud of our history. We want more games covering our history. So this is also a nice educational tool, because the Battle of Warsaw, published by Zielona Sowa, is a game which can be used as an educational tool. It is not a very complex game. This is a game which, in a scale from 1 to 10, I'd rate maybe a 4, not more. So this is not a game which will enable you to recreate in full detail the whole campaign, the whole battle. This will not be a hex and counter game using tons of markers, tons of units with combat resolution tables and other very complicated rules. This is a somewhat abstract game, a game which uses very straightforward mechanisms in order to enable this game to recreate an important battle, but at the same time to suit more people. Because one of the main reasonings behind this project was to create a game which will be suitable for a broad audience and which will serve as a pretext or an invitation to look deeper and find additional information about the battle. So from this point of view, I think that both the designer and the company scored a home run, because this is a game which will suit a lot of people because of its low level complexity and at the same time because of its subject. What I like in this game is its artwork, because when looking at this game we have two very distinctive parts. We have this very abstract part which is composed of the game board and of the meeples, which you will be using as armies or as troops if you prefer. So no cavalry units, no infantry units, no armor or no planes, just meeples. The board with some spaces, but very abstract also. And looking only at those elements, you might scratch your head, you might say, well, okay, this is very abstract, this is The Battle of Warsaw, or maybe the Battle of Gaugamela or something else, it's not important. It's so abstract, it can be anything. But then you look at the cards and you can say, wow, this is so pretty. And the artwork on those cards is really fantastic. This is one of the prettiest games that I have ever seen in terms of artwork on cards. And this is an excellent job by the artist which was responsible for the cards, because they are both pretty as also functional, and they represent a lot variety of officers which were involved in the Battle of Warsaw. So looking at the portraits, looking at the names, looking at the stats, at their capacities, which are somewhat related to what they did during the battle, is also a very, I'd say, a very strong educational aspect of this game. And I think that thanks to this part of the game, the whole as a game is rich and is just as it should be, in order to invite people to explore the story. So the game, when in terms of components, is, I'd say, of a high quality, but especially thanks to the cards. What I like in the terms of the mechanisms used in this game is the fact that this is an asymmetrical game. Both armies are the same when you look at the board. So again, you can see that this is very abstract. But then when you take a closer look at the decks used by both armies, you can see that they are different. They have a different set of orders. They have a different set of troops. They finally have a different set of officers with different abilities. So playing the Soviets and playing the Poles will be different. And this is good because the battle was asymmetrical, both armies were very different, and the game also should simulate this, and it does. Playing the Soviets, you'll try to put as many troops as you can using officers who increase the strength of your troops, whereas as the Poles, you'll very often try to launch counteroffensive, launch counterattacks, or initiate attacks when you have the opportunity to overcome your opponent before he has the option to prepare more troops at certain areas of the front line. So in terms of gameplay, this is good because playing both sides will give you a different feeling. The game is dynamic, it is quick to play with an interesting palette of actions that you can take. The game at the same time has some mechanisms which try to simulate in a somewhat abstract way how the battle was fought in 1920. So you have this different set of actions on your leaders. So you have the differentiation between the northern front, the central front, and the southern front. You have leaders associated to those fronts, which is again associated to what they did in reality in 1920. You have also the additional cards which enable you to compete for public support, for financing, so for elements which are essential in warfare, but which are very, very abstract in this game. You do not have absolutely any more accountancy than you should have. The time of play is extremely pleasant. It's from 49 to 90 minutes, but you can easily end a game in 60 or so. So this will be a game of not a very high complexity with an extremely interesting time of play. So this will game which will suit a lot of people, not only people who like games covering history, but also people who play casual games, tabletop games using Euro mechanisms. This is not a game which is that war gamey to distract other players. At the same time, it is not that Euro-ish to distract wargamers. So it's somewhere in the middle. What I think are the weaker points of Bitwa Warszawska, because I don't believe this is an outstanding title. It's absolutely correct, it's a good game covering a very important topic, but it has some flaws. The first one I'd say is related to the rules, to the rule book, because it is a game with a very short rule book with some very straightforward rules, but at the same time it's not crystal clear. There are some minor issues which I experienced while trying to play my first game, and I rapidly contacted the designer, received the answers in 5 minutes or so, but even so I had more questions. It's not something very terrible. Those are not questions concerning the core mechanics. Those are rather questions concerning some details which are concerning some actions, but they are still here. So in my opinion, with such a straightforward mechanical core, with such easy and accessible rules, the rulebook should have been crystal clear. It's not. It maybe would be a good idea to make a short frequently asked questions, post it on BGG or maybe on the company's web page. I know it would be useful. The second thing which deserves to be underlined is the fact that this game tends to be random, because you will make your actions depending on cards that you receive in your hand on each turn. Of course you can keep some cards, but keeping cards in your hand means that you are doing less during a turn than your opponent. If you're doing less, that probably means that you'll be losing battles, and losing battles means losing points. So at most times you'll be using all your cards which you have in your hand, unless you have absolutely no way to use in a positive way one of your assets. Given the fact that you are randomly drawing those cards means that sometimes you'll get bad draws, sometimes you'll get very good draws. You can, for instance, for 3 or 4 turns in a row, do not draw any leader. Sometimes you can draw too many leaders, or you can draw cards which enable you to place troops only on one of the fronts, for instance, only on the northern front. So those things happen, and this random distribution, this randomness will sometimes impact the outcome of the game. At the same time, what in my opinion is also a problem is the fact that when one side is really ahead in terms of points and it has more troops on the second front line, it's extremely difficult to return to the game and to counterattack from the perspective of the other side. Because remember that when applying losses after a battle, you always get rid of all the units which were located at the first front line, but those units which are stacked on the second front line remain. So if I have, for instance, 10 units on my second front line and my opponent has only 5, I'm 5 ahead. If I start my turn with 5 more units, I can just react to what my opponent does. He places 2 troops on the northern front, I place 1 troop on the northern front. If he moves 3 units, I'll move some units. If I have my leaders on the board, if I have a palette of cards, I'm almost always able to react. The same applies to the barriers, because if I want to get rid of a barrier, I play a card. But then my opponent can just replace this barrier where it was just a few moments ago. I'll retry it once more, and again he uses a card in order to replace this barrier. So you'll end the turn just as you started it, with the barrier at the same spot. Maybe this should have been done a little differently. Maybe only some cards could be used to move barriers. I don't know. Now, the way that the rules are written, I believe that sometimes you'll get dead draws. So you'll draw a set of cards, they seem to be powerful, but your opponent will just react to them, and the status quo will be maintained. Your opponent will win during the final battle resolution because he started the turn with more troops. So when you are ahead in terms of points, you have a good chance of winning the whole game. Having said that, I believe that Bitwa Warszawska is nevertheless an interesting game using interesting mechanics, a game which really should be used as an educational tool or as a tool to be an incentive to look deeper for details concerning the Battle of Warsaw. A game published by a very experienced designer, a game beautiful to look at, a game with a really nice and interesting time of play, a game which is not very complex, so this will suit a lot of people. If you have the possibility of trying this game, you should, especially if you're interested in the history of Poland. If you're not, maybe this game will be a pretext to look at our history and to read more about the Battle of Warsaw and on its impact on the history of Europe. This was the review of Bitwa Warszawska, the Battle of Warsaw, published by the Polish company Zielona, Sowa. Thank you a lot for watching this review. I hope that you will revisit our channel in some time. Take also a look at our Facebook and Instagram accounts. Have a terrific day and see you next time.